right, so we left off with farming ethos. So farming ethos is a big thing that we have to think about because this is going to dictate how we go about farming, right? So what do I mean by ethos? So I mean like conventional, organic, sustainable farming, biodynamic farming, right? Kind of the underlying philosophy that you use for your farming practices, right? So sustainability is obviously a big thing now. Generation Y, the millennials, and of course Generation Z are more and more interested in sustainability and buying sustainable products. So we're seeing sustainability labels and things on all kinds of different products now, right? Including wine. So for instance, in New Zealand, all of the wine exported from New Zealand has to be certified sustainable. So you go through a thing called Sustainable Wine Growers New Zealand. This, by the way, is conventional farming. So oftentimes I've heard people make this distinction of conventional farm, like I'm not conventional, I'm sustainable. It's conventional farming. But what this is, these sustainability organizations, what they do is growers get together in regions and they form certifications based on best management practices for the region. So they're trying to get rid of practices that have very little benefit to the farming system, but have quite a big detriment to the greater environment. Okay, but at the end of the day, we can still use the same kind of conventional chemistries that we used to use in these sustainable programs. So yeah, so you have a bunch of different regional sustainability organizations, and so you'll see these things all over people's labels all throughout the world. Generally, interestingly, like not at the really high end of the industry will you see these kinds of things on labels. There's a lot of market research that suggests that putting this kind of stuff on labels at the high end actually kind of diminishes people's perception of the quality of the wine, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, you will see these all over the place, and it's never the same. This is the Long Island Sustainability Group. This is Oregon. This one here is the Central Coast of California, mainly around Paso Robles. Of course, Napa has Napa Green and that sort of thing. Okay. So then we get to organic farming. So what is organic farming? It's just farming without synthetic chemicals, right? It's not farming without chemicals, it's farming without synthetic chemicals. So do you use fungicides in an organic farming system? Of course you do. Of course you do. But you're using things that are just mined. So like you're using sulfur, elemental sulfur, like elemental copper. There's different formulations of copper, but it's just kind of mined and then we spray it out. Sometimes you're using things like different kind of bacteria or different fungi that can act in kind of for pest control. And then in terms of like fertilization, you're using things like instead of, as a conventional farmer, I would use for like phosphorus, I would use like triple superphosphate. But in an organic system, I would use something like rock phosphate, which is just mined phosphate rock that's kind of ground up into a powder. Okay. And I would use different manures. I would use things like composts in an organic system, that sort of thing. So these are certified in the US by USDA Organic, which USDA Organic didn't actually start until, I believe it was 2002, but it was after the millennium. So this is actually a really new certification. But USDA Organic is the overarching certifying body for organic farming here in the United States. And then, of course, USDA Organic then underneath that certifies other agencies that go out and do the certification in the US. This is the symbol you'll see in Europe for organic products. And then, of course, here's BioGrow New Zealand. And then going even farther, biodynamics. So biodynamics is an interesting farming ethos, and one that you're probably only likely to see in the grape and wine world. There are biodynamic farms that do other things like cheese and all kinds of other different products, but it's very popular, relatively popular, at the high end of the grape and wine world. So What is biodynamics? So biodynamics is essentially kind of the first organic farming certification, at least Demeter. So like Demeter is this biodynamic certifying organization. They're kind of the first real organic farming certification ever. And biodynamics came about in the 1920s over a series of about, I think it was 6 or 8 lectures by a guy named Rudolf Steiner. If you're familiar with Steiner schools or Waldorf schools, it's kind of an alternative schooling concept at which I think some community farming is a big part of that. But Steiner created that pedagogical technique. He did many other things in his life, but in the 1920s, farms in Austria and kind of all over Europe started to fail, and it coincided with the release of some new chemicals, some new pesticides and fertilizers that came about because of World War I. And so people were putting out these pesticides and these fertilizers, and they were toxifying their soils, and then their farms were just kind of collapsing, yields were going down. And so this guy, Rudolf Steiner, saw this and thought, well, science has failed us, essentially. So we need to return to kind of a more faith-based approach to agriculture. So over about, like I said, 6 to 8 lectures, he presented this farming technique where it's organic farming with a faith-based component. And it's a system in which you think about the whole system. So with organics, for instance, you can certify an organic block. You can have one block on your farm that's organic and the rest of it can be conventional. You can't do that with biodynamics. The whole farm has to be biodynamic because the whole farm is considered an organism. All the parts working together. You're creating on-farm fertility, for instance. So you have animals, hopefully, and you're making composts and that sort of thing and putting that back into the system. And it's trying to be this kind of self-contained, sustainable system. Now, like I said, it is a sort of faith-based organics. So what makes it different from organics really is that holistic approach, but also there's some pretty interesting like esoteric practices that are definitely faith-based. So for instance, one of the major practices you have to do to be biodynamic is called these preparations. And one of the preparations is called BD 500, and you have to do it every year. So with BD 500, what you do is you take cow horns from cows who've calved at least once, and then you take manure and you fill the cow horn with manure, and then they believe that the cow horn is very adept at capturing terrestrial forces. So you put that cow horn in a hole in the fall. A lot of times people do it on the equinox. You put it in the hole facing up, and then you bury it. You let it stay in there for 6 months. It gets colonized by microbes that are already native to your soil. And then you take it out of that hole in the springtime, and it's broken down into like sweet earth, into like a compost. You dilute it about 1,000 to 1, and then you you dilute it 1,000 to 1 in water. Then you form a vortex in one direction, and that's to capture celestial forces because they believe that there should be a balance of terrestrial and celestial forces in order for these preparations to work and for there to be harmony on your farm. So you make a vortex in one direction, it captures celestial forces, you close it, creating chaos and disorder, and then you create a vortex in the other direction, and you do this back and forth for an hour, and then you apply it to the soil, and it's supposed to do things like promote humus formation, as well as promote root growth. Does it do those things? No. No. But it's fun. It's fun to do. But yeah, it's a faith-based system, and people use it in the wine industry definitely for marketing purposes. And, a lot of people certainly believe it. It works. So, yeah. But it is something you will see, especially at the high end of the wine industry. If you go and look at Domaine Romani Conti, that $10,000 bottle of Pinot Noir that I showed you, they farm those vineyards biodynamically and would tell you that this faith-based organic approach actually does have some sort of benefit to their farm.